Hello again, everyone. It's April the 16th, and I have a new post up this morning. Winterton, Curtis, and the Spirit of Science. The spring 2020 semester of Pandemic University is approaching its final weeks. This week, in both CoPhi and A&P, we've been concerned with Darwin and evolution and Michael Ruse's Darwinian existentialism, among many other things. That and the pending recurrence of my summer course, my summer MALA, Master of Liberal Arts course, Evolution in America, gives me all the pretext I think I need to return to the subject of my oft-mentioned first landlord, one Winterton C. Curtis. At our first meeting, and it'll probably be online, well, it certainly will be online, I'll probably mention for the first but not the last time my personal connection to evolution in America. The gentleman I call my first landlord, Winterton C. Curtis, was a zoologist at the University of Missouri. He was one of the expert witnesses who was called to Dayton to testify in the Scopes monkey trial, and one of the witnesses who was not allowed to testify. None of them were, because the judge ruled that the science of evolution was irrelevant to the question of whether the Tennessee statute prohibiting its teaching had been violated. Of course it had. But Winterton C. Curtis, distinguished old gentleman when I knew him, was already 50 years old by the time of the Scopes trial. I knew him. I have vivid memories of him. He was the landlord who rented upstairs rooms in his home to my parents when my father was finishing his veterinary degree at the University of Missouri when I was still just a toddler. I remember him coming to our home a few years later, after my father had graduated and set up his practice a little closer to St. Louis. And Dr. Curtis used to spend an evening and an overnight with us on his way to the St. Louis airport before he headed back up to his native New England during the breaks from school. But I remember him pulling dollars from my ear and handing them to me. So of course I was early favorably disposed towards the evolutionary hypothesis. But my late father, Dr. James C. Oliver, who received his degree from the University of Missouri Veterinary School in 1960, who was in all other respects pretty much the opposite of a mystic, was nonetheless convinced that Dr. Curtis somehow implanted in me my lifelong fascination with evolution. I don't know where it comes from. I did appreciate those dollars. But I do know that Dr. Curtis's neglected classic, his book Science and Human Affairs from the Viewpoint of Biology, published in 1922, is a real gem. And it's probably also the thing that got the attention of the lawyers in Dayton and got them to seek his presence as an expert on evolution. I particularly like Dr. Curtis's thoughts on what he called the humanistic philosophy of life, of which he said, "The humanistic philosophy of life which flowered in Greece and which has blossomed again is not the crude materialistic desire to eat, drink, and be merry. It is a spiritual joy in living and a confidence in the future, which makes this life a thing worthwhile. The otherworldliness of the Middle Ages does not satisfy the spiritual demands of modern times." And that was from his book called Science and Human Affairs from the Viewpoint of Biology. Of the Scopes trial itself, Dr. Curtis wrote of the 1925 Dayton, Tennessee spectacle. He wrote this years later. "The courtroom audience impressed me as honest country folk, in jeans and calico, boobs perhaps, as judged by the journalist H.L. Mencken, and holding all the prejudices of backwoods Christian orthodoxy, but nevertheless a significant section of the backbone of democracy in the USA. They came to see their idol, the great commoner, William Jennings Bryan, who joined and led the prosecution a twice or thrice failed presidential candidate who literally did not get out of Dayton alive, came to see him, the great commoner, the champion of the people, meet the challenge to their faith. They left bewildered, but with their beliefs unchanged, despite the manhandling of their idol by the infidel from Chicago. The infidel from Chicago being Clarence Darrow, who was the other high-profile, big-name lawyer who came to Dayton. He joined the defense. Dr. Curtis was sharing those recollections in a little piece he did for the Columbia Missourian newspaper, which was reprinted as D-Days at Dayton, Fundamentalism versus Evolution at Dayton, Tennessee by Winterton C. Curtis, 1956. And Curtis wrote, when thinking back on his early days as a professor, a young professor in the 1890s. Yes, I knew somebody who was a professor in the 1890s. He wrote, "Young New Englander comes to Little Dixie in 1901." But he interviewed for his position in the 1890s. In May of 1901, after I had completed all the requirements, except my oral examination for my doctor's degree at Johns Hopkins, I received a letter from Professor George Lefevre of the University of Missouri. We had taught together at the Marine Biological Laboratory before he went to Missouri in the fall of '99. And now he was writing me about an instructor being added to his staff. He invited me to visit Columbia at the university's expense so that I might be looked over and look the place over for myself. With my Van Dyke beard and pince-nez, I thought I would make a good impression. And by the way, if you look at the blog post, you'll see an image of Dr. Curtis in those days. Quite the dashing young figure he was, with his Van Dyke beard. Thought I would make a good impression and hope that I should like the University of Missouri as much as I like Lefevre. He goes on to recount what a really primitive place Columbia, Missouri still was at the turn of the century. And Little Dixie indeed. But here's a bit of, oh, never mind, I've got a link to a slideshow that I made out of our MALA trip to Dayton in the summer of '18, which you can look at the blog site if you wish. But let me conclude this way. Winterton Curtis anticipated Everybody's Story, which is a book by a guy named Loyal Rue, a philosopher/theologian, who wanted to argue in that book, and I think successfully did, argue that evolution is everybody's story, even though not everybody wants to admit it. That it gives the fullest and most coherent account of where all of this came from, not all of this nature, but all of this culture and religion and philosophy. Right? It's all evolved. Our moral codes are evolved. Everything is evolved and evolving. And if you want to take a step back, a further step back from Darwin, the universe itself is in an evolutionary process. Check out that Monty Python video, the Galaxy song that I posted this morning in response to Hayden's post of Eric Idle in The Life of Brian singing "Always Look on the Bright Side." But yeah, Curtis anticipated Everybody's Story in that book that I was quoting from, and he anticipated more recently Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, when Curtis wrote that religion of whatever sort is a product of human evolution. Got an embed of an excerpt from The Present Importance of Science, a chapter in Curtis's book. And in saying that science feeds the spiritual as well as the material person, Curtis anticipated Carl Sagan and his cosmic spirituality, his sense, as summarized by his widow Andrea, his widow and his collaborator, that Darwin's insight that life evolved over the eons through natural selection was not just better science than Genesis, it also afforded a deeper, more satisfying spiritual experience. That's a quote from The Varieties of Scientific Experience, a Personal View of the Search for God. By the way, that title is a deliberate echo of William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. It was published posthumously based on Sagan's Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1985. But Sagan was a fan of James, and the Varieties of Scientific Experience is the perfect bookend and mirror of the varieties of a religious experience. Well, anyway, how gratified Carl Sagan would be to read his daughter Sasha's new book. She didn't get to know her father very well before he passed away in 1996. But Sasha Sagan has written a book called For Small Creatures Such as We, Rituals for Finding Meaning in Our Unlikely World. He would be so gratified to read it. It is a lovely example of secular spirituality. She writes, "Growing up in our home, there was no conflict between science and spirituality. My parents taught me that nature, as revealed by science, was a source of great stirring pleasure. Logic, evidence, and proof did not detract from the feeling that something was transcendent. Quite the opposite. It was the source of its magnificence." And she writes, "Days and weeks go by, and the regularity of existing eclipses the miraculousness of it." Maybe that's especially true in the middle of a quarantine. "But there are certain moments when we manage to be viscerally aware of being alive. Sometimes those are terrifying moments, like narrowly avoiding a car accident. I can tell you about that if you ever want to hear the story. I returned from Murfreesboro one evening a couple of years ago. But no, I'll save that for another time. Terrifying moments, or sometimes they're beautiful moments, like holding your newborn in your arms. And then there are the quiet moments in between, when all the joy and sorrows seem profound only to you, the small but precious moments. Above all, this secular and thoroughly naturalized form of spirituality insists that human meaning is an achievement. As Sasha's dad used to say, if you want life to mean something, don't just sit there, do something meaningful. Make a difference." All right, well, stay well, be active, keep reading, posting, joining the discussion, keep the conversation alive, and give serious thought to posting an early draft of your final report blog post. And I will talk to you soon. Bye.